I've always thought my neighborhood was safe and quiet, but the nights I'm about to share completely changed the way I see being alone at home. Today, I want to share 3 terrifying true stories where even authorities had no way to intervene. These are not ghost tales or exaggerations, they are real experiences in which ordinary people found themselves helpless, facing situations that logic, law, and common sense couldn't control. In the fall of 2021, I moved into a small townhouse in southern Illinois, hoping to start over after a difficult breakup. It was my first time living completely alone. I was 27, with a stable job and a predictable routine, but the thought of being by myself in a new place carried a strange mix of excitement and unease. The neighborhood seemed perfect on the surface, quiet, orderly, and tucked away in a cul-de-sac. The row of townhouses all looked the same, with pale siding, neatly trimmed hedges, and tidy driveways. Most of the residents were older couples, though a few young families lived nearby. It felt peaceful in a sterile sort of way, the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves. That suited me just fine. But almost immediately, one neighbor stood out. About 3 houses down lived a tall, broad man in his mid-40s. He had a heavy build, a scruffy beard, and an odd routine that unsettled me from the very first week. Every night, no matter when I pulled into my driveway, he was outside. Sometimes he leaned against his porch railing, smoking or pacing. Other times, he simply stood at the edge of his driveway, staring into the darkness. It wasn't that he looked at me directly, at least, not always. It was his stillness. He never checked his phone, never shifted his weight, never waved. He just stood there like a statue, unmoving and deliberate. I told myself he was probably restless, maybe an insomniac, but the sight of him always made my stomach tighten. For the first few weeks, I tried to brush it off. But then the noises started. One night in mid-September, I was jolted awake at 2:30 a.m. by the sound of metal scraping against wood. At first, I thought I had dreamed it, but then came the unmistakable crunch of footsteps moving slowly across gravel. My backyard wasn't grass, it was lined with decorative stone, so every step was distinct. My bedroom sat at the back of the townhouse with a sliding glass door leading outside. Crouching low, I peeked through the blinds, heart pounding. The motion light never turned on. Whoever was out there knew how to move carefully enough to avoid it. I called the police. 2 officers arrived, walked the property, and found nothing. No footprints, no damage, no sign of forced entry. They told me it was probably an animal. I knew better, but I had no proof. The next morning, I checked the yard myself. That's when I noticed a flat stone wedged under the fence gate, just large enough to keep it from swinging shut. The placement was deliberate, like someone wanted to slip in later without making noise. I called the police again. They noted it in their report but explained that without a crime, there was nothing they could pursue. 2 nights later, I woke again, this time to the sound of my back door handle rattling. The knob turned gently at first, then harder, as if someone was testing it. I stayed hidden, shaking, clutching the only weapon I had, a dull kitchen knife. When the motion light finally clicked on, a shadow passed across the blinds. A man was standing there. By the time officers arrived, he was gone. They found footprints in the gravel but, once again, insisted their hands were tied. That was when I bought security cameras. The first night I stayed up watching the live feed, my stomach dropped. At 2:23 a.m., the backyard camera caught him. A tall figure in a black hoodie and gloves slipped through the gate, moved deliberately to avoid the light, and finally looked straight up at the lens. He smiled, a slow, stretched grin, before stepping back into the darkness. I didn't sleep in the townhouse again. I packed a bag, checked into a hotel, and started making plans to leave for good. When I returned to collect the rest of my things, I found muddy handprints smeared across the glass door, one high, one low, as though someone had crouched there, just waiting, just watching. The final straw came the day I moved out. In my mailbox was a note written in cramped handwriting: "They'll leave. I won't." A month later, a woman who moved into my old unit messaged me on Facebook. She asked if I had ever noticed someone in a black hoodie around the backyard, because she kept hearing footsteps at night. She said that just the night before, someone had knocked on her glass door around 2 a.m. and stood there in silence. I never replied. I didn't want to know what happened next. In 2020, my work with a property preservation team brought me to places most people would never dare to enter: abandoned homes, foreclosures, and properties left to decay. Some were sad, others unsettling, but none ever felt dangerous. That changed the day I was assigned to a house deep in a remote stretch of upstate New York. The drive itself was eerie. For miles, the road wound through empty farmland and skeletal trees, with not a single car in sight. Eventually, I passed through what was once a small town, but it looked more like a ghost of itself. A gas station with boards nailed across the windows, a diner with its roof caved in, and a few shuttered shops that seemed untouched since the 1980s. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence where you realize how far you are from help. The house sat at the very edge of this forgotten place. It stood isolated, surrounded on three sides by dense woods that pressed in close, as if swallowing it whole. The paint had long since peeled from the siding, windows sagged in their frames, and the porch leaned to one side like the house itself was tired of standing. From the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt something unnatural. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. No birds. No insects. No wind moving through the trees. It was as if the entire area held its breath, waiting. Inside, the atmosphere thickened. With the utilities shut off for more than a year, the house was cold and stale. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled of mildew mixed with something faintly metallic. The rooms looked as though the family had simply walked out one day and never returned, lace curtains drooping in the windows, porcelain figurines staring blankly from shelves, wooden chairs sitting patiently at the dining table. It felt preserved, almost staged. Yet something was wrong. One room in particular caught my attention. On the far wall, a massive corkboard stretched nearly from floor to ceiling, covered in yellowed newspaper clippings. Every single clipping was an obituary. Names, dates, and photographs pinned in neat, obsessive rows. It wasn't a memorial, it was a record. Someone had been cataloging deaths. Standing there, scanning the faces of strangers long gone, I felt watched, as though the eyes in the photographs were aware of me. Then my work phone rang. The screen showed "unknown caller," even though there was no cell service in the area. Against my better judgment, I answered. Static crackled on the line, followed by silence. Before I could process it, a sharp ring echoed from upstairs. I froze. In the master bedroom, sitting on the nightstand, was a rotary phone. Dusty, disconnected, useless, yet it rang again. The sound was piercing, unnatural in the dead air of the house. I stood paralyzed, my pulse racing, every nerve in my body telling me not to answer. When it finally went silent, the house felt darker, heavier, like something unseen had just moved closer. Shaken, I forced myself back to work, inspecting the basement. The air was damp, and the smell of metal grew stronger. Against one wall sat a stack of old, yellowed notebooks. Flipping one open, I found lists of names, dates, and scribbled notes. Some looked like call logs, others like warnings, short phrases such as, "Don't let them in," or "Watched me all night." It wasn't just unsettling. It felt like the house itself was keeping records, documenting anyone who stepped inside long after its family had gone. As I moved through the basement, shadows shifted in the corners of my vision. Whispers brushed against my ears, too soft to make out but too real to ignore. I left in a panic, abandoning the inspection halfway through. Later, when I refused to return, a colleague was sent in my place. He was skeptical, convinced I had just scared myself. But when he came back, his face was pale. He reported the same experiences, the disconnected phone ringing, the static-filled calls, the suffocating silence. He quit the job immediately afterward. Authorities investigated but found nothing, no intruders, no tampered wiring, no explanation. The house still stands there, empty, its curtains drawn. But those who've gone inside say the same thing: the house isn't empty at all. It watches. It records. And it remembers. In 2019, I moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, an older, single-story place with peeling paint and creaky floors, but the price was right, and it gave me the privacy I wanted. At first glance, it seemed perfectly normal. But there was one feature that unsettled me from the very beginning: the basement. Unlike most houses, the light switch wasn't at the top of the stairs. It was placed halfway down, which meant every time I entered, I had to step into complete darkness first. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, the air was damp and heavy, and the shadows seemed to close in on me until I reached that switch. At first, I brushed it off as an old house quirk, but the more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. Almost intentional, as if the house itself wanted to keep the basement shrouded in darkness. For the first few weeks, nothing strange happened. I unpacked, settled into a routine, and convinced myself I was imagining the unease. The neighborhood was quiet, and the nights were peaceful. Until one October night, when everything changed. I was getting ready for bed, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, when I heard it: 3 knocks on the basement door. They weren't faint creaks or the random pops of old wood. They were deliberate. Slow. Evenly spaced. Each knock strong enough to make the door vibrate slightly in its frame. I froze in the hallway, every hair on my arm standing up. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but how could they have gotten past the locked doors and windows? I stood there for minutes, straining my ears, but the knocks didn't repeat. Finally, I convinced myself it had to be the pipes or some strange quirk of the old structure. I went to bed telling myself it was nothing. But the next night, it happened again. 3 knocks. Same time. Same rhythm. This time they sounded sharper, more insistent. My pulse raced as I stood on the other side of the door, staring at the doorknob, half expecting it to turn on its own. But it didn't. The third night, I decided to ignore it. I put in headphones, turned up the volume, and tried to drown it out. But even through the music, I felt the vibration of those knocks, steady and deliberate, like a hand demanding to be acknowledged. Then came the breathing. One night after the knocks, I pressed my ear against the door, desperate to know if I was imagining things. That's when I heard it: slow, steady breathing. Not mine. Not mechanical. Human. It was so close, just inches away, as though someone stood on the other side, waiting for me to open the door. The sound stopped the second I stumbled back in fear. Panic set in. I checked every lock in the house twice over. I inspected the windows for signs of tampering. I even sprinkled flour near the back door to see if I'd catch footprints in the morning. Nothing. The authorities came once after I called in fear, but they found no evidence of an intruder. To them, I was just a nervous tenant in an old, creaky house. But deep down, I knew better. The knocks didn't stop. The breathing didn't stop. In fact, they grew bolder. Sometimes I'd hear faint scratching noises at the base of the door. Sometimes the handle would rattle, just enough to make me doubt whether I actually saw it move. The house felt alive, watching, waiting for me to give in. Finally, one night, I snapped. Armed with a flashlight, I flung the basement door open and stomped down the stairs. The air was icy and thick, pressing against my lungs. Each step groaned under me as I made my way to the switch. When the light flickered on, the basement looked empty, just concrete walls, old boxes, and shadows. But it didn't feel empty. The silence was too heavy, the air too charged, as if something had slipped just out of sight. I stayed awake until sunrise, staring at that door. The knocks didn't come again that night. But the next evening, right after midnight, they returned. Louder. Demanding. Almost angry. That was the breaking point. I couldn't take another night. I packed my belongings into my car, left the keys on the counter, and drove away without a backward glance. I didn't care about breaking the lease or losing money, I just needed to escape. Years have passed, but the memory lingers. Sometimes I still hear phantom knocks in the quiet of the night, faint echoes of that basement door. 3 knocks. Always 3. Followed by the sound of steady breathing in the dark. Some houses aren't meant to be lived in. And some things, once they notice you, never truly let you go. Some dangers cannot be contained or prevented, even when help is sought. The watcher, the abandoned house, the basement, they leave a lasting unease, a reminder that safety is not always guaranteed. Trust your instincts, stay aware of your surroundings, and never ignore what feels wrong. If these stories left you unsettled, subscribe for more true accounts of unexplained events, and share them with someone brave enough to hear the truth.